Hello and welcome to meaningoflife.tv. I'm Philip Menchaca, project coordinator at Union Theological Seminary, and you are Dr. Jenny Butler, lecturer in the Department of Study of Religions at University College Cork.
Hello, thank you for inviting me onto the show.
Yes, thank you for joining me. I'm excited to talk with you today. Just a bit about your background here. You study contemporary religions in Ireland. You teach, study as well, contemporary religions in Ireland, Western esotericism and new religious movements. And I believe you were awarded a Government of Ireland Research Scholarship for your work on contemporary Irish pagan culture.
Yeah, so my main research is ethnography, and so far that's been with the pagan community. And as you said, I teach on a variety of different religions in contemporary Ireland. So my specialism within that, I suppose, would be the new religious movements and Western esoteric traditions, and trying to bring the history of the Irish context into that.
Okay. And, I want to start by discussing just some specific rituals and practices and the kinds of expressions of Irish paganism that you've seen in your research. And in doing so along the way, we'll get into kind of what specifically characterizes the Irish pagan worldview in particular. So first, just to let our listeners and viewers know, you study neo-paganism, or paganism with a capital P, as opposed to paganism with a lowercase p. If you could explain kind of what the difference is between that.
Okay, well, academics tend to use neo-pagan. So neo just means new, but for the pagan community, some people feel that this is an attempt by academics to diminish the credibility or the authenticity of paganism. So that's not why I used the term. I'm kind of moving towards just using contemporary paganism because since I started researching, which is in 2001 for my doctoral thesis, the profile of paganism has raised quite a bit in Ireland, so people are becoming more familiar with it. But the reason I use neo-pagan to begin with was to distinguish it from ancient or indigenous traditions, so meaning the contemporary cultural and religious movement. Many followers of paganism feel that pagan should have a capital. Pagan should be capitalized because Christian, Judaism, Islam, and so on are capitalized. So,
okay. And now I think first it's important to say that paganism is just this big umbrella term that includes kind of a wide range of magical and spiritual practices, and I think, and you can correct me if you've seen different in your studies, but I think that oftentimes people kind of misunderstand when they hear paganism. They might think of Satanism and Ruth Gordon and Rosemary's Baby and that kind of popular portrayals of paganism. But could you kind of just give us quickly a definition of why that's misunderstanding and what you study particularly?
I think those misunderstandings come from stereotypes that are reinforced by the media. Also, as you mentioned, Rosemary's Baby, horror films. People especially when it's something that's not commonly known about. So in the Irish context, maybe compared to America, you have less awareness of paganism as a religion, and those negative stereotypes are reinforced by various different influences. You asked me for a definition. So paganism is, as you mentioned, an umbrella term or a catch-all term for a whole range of different magical and spiritual traditions. And within the kind of umbrella of paganism, you have different paths or traditions in the pagan usage of the word. So path or tradition is like a denomination or a type of paganism. So that would include shamanism, different shamanistic techniques as well, even if someone doesn't self-identify as a shaman. Different forms of witchcraft, including Wicca, which is one modern form of witchcraft. There's Nordic traditions and heathenism, Druidry. So at the outset of my research, I had to decide, because my doctoral research was the first ever ethnographic study, and as far as I'm aware, the first academic study, a longitudinal study to date. There are people, that are becoming interested in this field in Ireland now, but because it was the first one, I wanted to give a broad overview of the Irish pagan community, but at the same time I had to narrow it down to certain paths or traditions, because it would be too unwieldy otherwise and I would be researching forever. So I picked the traditions of Druidry and also Wicca, and other forms of pagan witchcraft, because they seemed the most visible in Ireland at the time. And I also, in my interviewing of people, ethnographic interviews, I would also seek to interview anybody who self-identifies as pagan generically, because not everybody is part of a particular tradition or path of paganism. They might just self-identify as pagan.
Now, just very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you mentioned Druidism and Wicca, and Wicca, comes from at least one form of it was started by a guy named Gerald Gardner, correct?
Yeah.
And it's one of the more well-known types of practices, and tends to be kind of earth-based, right?
Yeah.
And then Druidism, could you give just a very quick definition of how that is different than Wicca?
Well, modern Druidry connects with the pre-Christian Celtic priests, the priests of the Celts, and there's some debate whether the Druids predated the influx of Celtic peoples, but it's not really possible to find out whether that's true or not. But it's again a nature-based tradition, because the ancient Celtic religion was, from what's known through mythology and archaeology and so on, was a polytheistic religion, so many different gods and goddesses, and many of those deities are connected with the natural landscape. So in the medieval manuscripts, that's the collection in the Irish case of the mythological material that was written down in the Christian period. There are stories of heroes and gods, so that's the main source of information about the indigenous or the pre-Christian religion. So modern Druids connect with that material and those deities, and the landscape and sacred sites also, like the Hill of Tara in County Meath, and stone circles and other megalithic monuments, many of which, for example, Newgrange in County Meath, because Meath, the counties of Meath and Westmeath are part of what was the sacred centre of the country in ancient Ireland, and some of those sites predate the Celtic peoples, but they still form part of the same kind of religiosity.
Okay. Now, one part of your research that you've done is participant observation study, correct?
Yes.
And can you explain what that is?
Yeah, participant observation is an anthropological method. So I took part in different kinds of rituals. So that included life cycle rituals and also festival celebrations, which usually involve a ritual. So I took part with different individuals and different groups. So whether it's the ritual group for witches, is called a coven, and the ritual group for Druids is called a grove. So I took part in rituals with as many different groups as I could, and to get a sense of what it's like to be pagan. And also I took part in other events. For example, there's a Tara summer solstice gathering, which isn't specifically pagan, but you have a big pagan input into the events that go on there. So I did the participant. So it's an observation. You're observing what's going on, but also taking part. So it's a dual kind of a experience.
Yeah. Now, is there a particular ritual or rite of passage or something like that is especially common that you could give us a description of?
Yes, I mean the rituals that I took part in would generally begin the same way. There's for both Druids and Wiccans. At the start there's a casting of the circle. So there's a sacred or magical circle, and it's cast by either, like, cast is a technical term in paganism. So it's either visualized or it's marked out.
Visualization. So they're imagining the circle forming.
Mm-hmm. Like an energetic circle, and the quarters are then called. So the cardinal points, or the compass points, north, south, east, and west, have different magical associations. And you've earth, air, fire, and water, which are represented in the five-pointed star or the pentacle. So it's the four elements, and ether or spirit. So that's what the star represents, the pentacle. And so once the circle is cast and the quarters are called, and there's different elementals or different beings that are also associated with each direction. And then depending on what the ritual is for, there might be a deity invoked or called upon to watch over the ritual. For example, at Lunasa, which is the harvest festival, the god Lu, who in the Celtic and the Irish tradition is a solar deity and connected with harvest time, he might be called upon to be present, or his energy invoked during the ritual.
Is the idea that when you're invoking these deities, they are they're present there in the ritual and are condoning it or bringing their divine power to the casting of it?
That depends on who you ask. I mean, the beliefs of individuals and groups is so diverse. That's the thing I find most difficult to get across. Two pagans might have almost opposite beliefs about divinity or about the nature of reality, or what magic is, or but you could even have two people in a coven or a grove that have differing beliefs, and that's acceptable within paganism, because it's not a there's no dogma, and it's not a kind of prescriptive type of religiosity. So that some people believe that deities are that they're the word invoke is also can also be contested. What I mean by invoke here is more like an invitation for a deity to be present. But
so they may or may not appear or make their presence known.
But some people do believe that they are literally present and can sense that energy. For example, with one Druid group, a grove called the Owl Grove, which is part of the Hibernian Order of Druids. It's a particular Druidic organisation. they often call on the she, or the fairies, to take part in rituals. So they would believe that the fairies are literally there, that their energy is influencing or adding to something to the ritual, and the energy that's raised. So the earth energy, or the some people define magic as equivalent to earth energy. So again, these things really depend on who you're talking to, and what their specific beliefs are. But in the case of this particular group, they raise energy, which they would then send out for a specific purpose into the world. So oftentimes that's to do with healing. It might be like usually in their festival celebrations, it will be like the festival will be a strong theme. So the seasonal energies and things like that are brought into the ritual. There's usually a sharing of mead, which is a drink made from honey, and bread is also shared within the sacred circles. So sometimes you have that aspect to rituals, especially to do with the festivals.
Now, is there generally one person that leads the festival or the ritual?
That depends on the type of paganism, the tradition or path, and it also depends on the group. So, for example, with Wicca, you can have a high priest and a high priestess, and gender binary is maybe more significant within Wicca than in Druidry, and you would have some covens like to have 13 members, so that might be 12 members and a high priestess.
And what's the significance of that number, 13?
Well, there's the moon, and the historical references to 13 members of a coven in the witch trial material, but you have the moon can be very important for different kinds of witchcraft traditions. So you have meetings on the full moon in Wicca are called esbats, and then there are many beliefs about the blue moon, or a 13th moon. So the energy of the moon and the sun, so solar and lunar energies are important in magic. Many different, like in folk magic, which contemporary pagans connect with, and in ceremonial magic. So, for example, when the moon is waning, that's associated more with symbolic death and decay, whereas when it's waxing, it's more powerful if you want to do a particular type of spell casting. The cosmic energies come into the practice of magic.
Mm-hmm. So now, this may seem, I don't know, like a naive question or something, but I mean, can you offer a definition of what magic is? I mean, how is this conceived of as this energy or this force? Are there different ideas about what it actually is?
There are many different ideas about what magic is among the pagan community. So a lot of people, particularly in Wicca, would use the definition of magic that was created by the ceremonial magician Aleister Crowley, the British notorious magician, and that is to do with focusing the will, but it's not necessarily willpower. It's the will again the will. The magical will is a technical term for pagans, and it's the intent. So the ritual is done with a specific intent, and that energy is then directed toward a certain goal. So magic is a force that can be psychically directed. According to that understanding of magic.
So in that understanding, it's an actual physical force of some kind that's generated by the intention that you bring to achieve a certain end?
Yeah, many people that I've interviewed have talked about science and magic, and the idea that science will one day catch up with these beliefs, that there is some other force, whether it's called etheric energy or magic. Someday science will be able to measure that as you would electricity. So there is that idea that there's this other force that humankind doesn't yet understand, but other people would define magic as energies in the earth. So this is more like it's not a completely different idea, because you still have the idea of a physical force, but to do with ley lines, currents of earth energies running under the ground,
like magnetic fields or something analogous to that.
Something that can be connected with through the physical earth, and that's why many people, many groups or individuals choose to go out onto the landscape to be closer to the earth energies, and that for them is magic. So like there's a distinction, I suppose, between a psychic energy that's coming from human beings, or being I don't know if manipulated is the right word, but something that an energy or force that is being directed by humans by use of their psychic abilities and ritual, and then something that people can connect with, that's or synchronize with, that's there in the natural world. I don't know if I'm explaining that very well.
No, I think
there are different understandings of what magic is.
Yeah, and so if you're thinking of the conception that it are these forces residing in or generated by the earth, is that a reason for these holy sites you'd mentioned earlier, like these, I think you said the Hill of Tara, or the stone circles? Are these thought of as areas where there is a particularly strong force that one can connect with residing in that location, that physical location?
Yes, many believe, because these sites are associated with the ancient practice of paganism by the Druids, or the people in general, the Celtic peoples. There is a belief in residual magic from ancient rituals that still permeates the sites. So there's that idea, and then you also have the belief that certain landscape features, such as in Ireland we have what are called ring forts. Colloquially they're known as fairy forts, and there's the belief then that the energy or the power is coming from the other world of the Sidhe or the fairies. So in that sense it's more a nexus, or a connection point between the spiritual realm and the human world that's found in the landscape. So there's a distinction to be made between magic in the sense of Aleister Crowley, and then forces that are coming from the other world. So they're not necessarily, like, people can believe in both actually, and might describe them differently. But the energies, there are many different conceptualizations of energies and forces in the world, and some of those would be coming from deities or spirits or fairies, rather than being an earth energy or something that's permeating the world all the time.
Now this goes to an interesting point. So I visited Ireland several months ago, and one thing I noticed, in certain locations people would tie bits of cloth to trees or other things like that, and I was told this was a kind of ritual way of connecting with the fairies, the Sidhe, right?
She.
Is that? I mean, this is kind of is it accurate to say it's almost become like a cultural practice that has been adopted from maybe this magical or pagan beliefs?
Yes, it's these traditions are likely quite ancient in origin, and when Christianity arrived in Ireland, it was a more harmonious. It's described as being more harmonious than it was in other places, in that the ancient the old religion, aspects of the old religion merged with Christianity in terms of the cosmology, and the practices then continued on the popular or the folk level. So Roman Catholicism in Ireland is described as syncretic, because you still have these so-called pagan elements in it. So the practice that you mentioned of tying the little rags to the trees is considered a Catholic, or it can be considered a Catholic tradition. It's connected to what's called the Pattern Day, where people go on like a local pilgrimage to a tree. Sometimes there's a holy well near the tree, and it's called Pattern because it's a Hiberno English way of saying patron. It came from patron saint, and every parish in Ireland has its own patron saint, or every area has a particular saint connected with it. So these traditions that were likely connected to the fairies or the Sidhe in ancient Ireland became part of the practice of the folk practice of Catholicism. And now you have contemporary pagans reconnecting with aspects of the folk religion. They're kind of untying those strands again to pick out the pagan elements, but leaving out the Christian parts. But to mention something to do with those rag trees, or wishing trees as they're called sometimes, the tradition is strongly associated with the fairies, that you leave. Tying the ribbon or the rag is sometimes to do with healing, like a wish for healing. And the trees that are associated with the fairies are called hawthorn or whitethorn. And that specific tree became associated with Saint Patrick. So in some cases you have just a merging of the traditions. So then they become associated with Christianity when they were likely in origin pagan. So it's quite complex in terms of cultural traditions and identity then, because you have different religions claiming certain aspects of the rituals and customs.
I think this is a phenomenon you often see in cultures that have frequently Christianity experienced colonization, and where you have this syncretic beliefs, where oftentimes there's still a largely Christian, Catholic, and I'm thinking particularly of in Mesoamerica. But then you get these little bits of holdovers from pre-Christian beliefs. So kind of continuing here with our theme of what makes Irish paganism distinctly Irish. In your interactions with these communities, did you ever get the sense that people had the idea that by engaging in pagan practice, they're reviving aspects of Irish culture that were suppressed in the past? Was that part of what the appeal is for this?
I think so, yes. It's a spiritual resurgence. So many people feel, many pagans feel that because of many different influences and agendas, like not only the Christianization of the country, but also the colonization of the country. You had aspects of the spirituality or religion of the people that was denigrated and suppressed or stamped out in some cases. So the way of reviving or reconnecting with that is mainly in what I've seen from interviews and from the rituals I've taken part in, is mainly through the landscape and the mythology, and also the popular traditions and folklore, and also with the Irish language for some, because the language is part of the indigenous way of describing the spiritual connection to the land and the place names. So many places are named for goddesses or associated with deities or with the she. For example, the River Shannon, which is the biggest and longest river in Ireland, that's named for the goddess Shannon, who is a member of the Tuatha Dé Danann, which is associated with the fairies in Irish folklore. So it is the natural landscape and those megalithic monuments that are the kind of the physical connection point, and then you also have things like language.
Okay, can you give an example of a figure or folklore, a figure from folklore, or a story that has been incorporated and become an important part of Irish pagan practice?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on the group or the individual or solitary practitioner.
The eternal disclaimer.
And again, it depends also on where the person or the group is located in Ireland, because pagans tend to observe the annual cycle, the rituals associated with the different festivals. So practically, they might choose somewhere that's in their locality to do the ritual and the celebration. So one example, because I mentioned the goddess Shannon or Shannon, there is a grove named the Grove of Shannon in County Leitrim, and they visit a place called the Shannon Pot, which is I don't know if it's the source of the Shannon, or I don't think it's no, it's not the source. It's where the river starts to rise, and it looks like a cauldron, and there's underground springs and which bubble. So that's part of the attraction for this group of this particular spot. It looks like a cauldron, and they honour the goddess Shannon every Imbolc, which is the start of spring. So the name Imbolc either comes from I-milk, which is Old Irish, which means it's thought to mean use milk, or Imbolg, which is modern Irish for in the belly. So these are both references to lambing season, so the start of spring. So this this Grove of Shannon, they take some water from the Shannon Pot and they bring it to they have a ritual centre also where they live, which they use for ritual, and the water is put into let's say a bowl that's used then in another ritual at another time of the year. They also have their own holy well, so sacred water source near where they live. So the story of Shannon involves a well that she there was a gesh or a taboo on a particular well, and she was the goddess was collecting hazelnuts, and some of the nuts fell into this well that the Druids had put a spell on, and when she put her hand into the well to retrieve the nuts, a spirit was unleashed, and then the water started to flow, and this spirit consumed her and she became part of the river. So this story of the goddess physically being made into the river is significant for this group. So that's why the water is significant in the rituals. So there is really a connection with the different myths and how those stories are connected to landscape.
That raises two questions in my mind. So maybe we'll address them in turn. But first, what role does animism play in these practices, since that suggests animism being a belief that there are spirits present all over in nature, and things like trees and water and just rocks everywhere in nature. So what role does animism play in these practices and beliefs? And so we can talk about that first, and then second, maybe we'll get to, as you answer this too, how do pagans, and I know it's going to have to be a generalized answer here because there's a lot of different beliefs about it. I mean, how do they conceive of God or gods or goddesses? Because the story there seems to suggest that, in Christian belief, God is all-powerful, but if a druid spell can trap or transform a goddess, as it did in that story, it suggests that there's a different idea about what these beings actually are.
I think the druid's spell was to keep the spirit in the well. So I'm not sure if the story is saying that the druids created the power of the goddess.
Is the idea? Is the idea that there was this power that overpowered the goddess and brought her into the water?
Yeah, but you have to be aware as well that the stories were modified by the Christian scribes that wrote them down. So there's so much ambiguity about about the other world or the spirit realm, for example. It's not really made clear in these manuscripts. There are references to it being under the ocean. There are references to the heavens, but it's likely that either the scribes were writing the stories down as they understood them, or that they intentionally changed things and left out a lot of information. So it's in terms of understanding ancient pagan religion and the cosmology, you can't really rely on those texts in that sense. But I'm not entirely sure whether the story that I told you about Shannon is from the manuscripts or whether it's a legend found in the oral tradition, because you also have folklore which is passed down through time, but it hasn't been recorded in the medieval manuscripts. Right. So you have the written or the oral tradition being different sometimes, or variations on the same themes. So those questions are quite hard to answer in terms of the ancient religion. Okay. But for you asked about animism.
Yeah, for contemporary, then what role how does this play out in contemporary practice and belief? Yeah.
Well, you can define contemporary paganism as an animistic religion, and as I said, like the contemporary pagans in Ireland are connecting with the pre-Christian or the indigenous religion, which is known through archaeology and the mythology as being an animistic religion. So the beliefs in, the popular or folk belief in fairies is coming from what were called She, the their deities in the manuscripts. So the Tuatha means the people of the goddess Anu. So these are their deities, and then you have a different understanding much later on in time in folklore. Maybe the gods became diminutive over time because their power was taken away by the way in which the ancient stories were recorded, and also by the literal demonization of otherworldly powers and beings by especially the Catholic Church in the Irish context. So it's likely that this is, these folk beliefs come from an animistic religion, because you have fairies living in trees and rocks, or that they are associated with trees and rocks. So it might not be, the belief might not be that they inhabit them, but they might be part of them in a more animistic sense, that the essence of a tree is part of the she. So the detail of those aspects has been lost to us in Ireland, in comparison, let's say, to Greece. So you have Greek mythology in a more it was more I don't want not complete, but you have much a bigger
record.
Picture, or Egyptian mythology. But in the Irish context, it's just a collection of stories, which the kind of general categorization of deities and spirits is not there, so it can be quite confusing, to try and understand what ancient people might have believed. But it does point towards animism, and rivers. Votive offerings were found in rivers, and the place names and sacred sites associated with those deities. It does seem to be an animistic religion in the ancient context,
and in the modern context as well. Is that correct? Where a lot of rituals and practices about connecting with these spirits or divine beings,
yes,
that exist in the natural world.
Yes, and that's generally through going out on the landscape and doing rituals to connect with those deities or spirits or fairies, or however they're understood.
And do you see a lot of interest in conservation for that reason, in environmental protection and that kind of thing?
Yes, many, this is, something that came through extremely strongly in my discussions and interviews with pagans. Many view themselves as guardians of the earth. They feel that that's the role of pagans in the modern world, to protect the earth and to live in a way that doesn't damage the planet. So you would have, various ecological concerns, and the pagan involvement in the campaign against the M3 motorway, which the construction of which destroyed part of the Hill of Tara. So the pagan involvement was very significant in that case, and in other ways as well. So many people have talked about that as being extremely important in their lives, and the destruction of the natural landscape is worrying for them, because it's either the connection point, or it's the literal habitation of fairies and other beings that are other spirit beings.
Mm-hmm. And so, aside from activism, are there spiritual practices that they undertake to care for the earth? Healing rituals or anything like that directed towards the landscape? Yes,
there's what's called green magic. Some people refer to it as green magic, healing for the earth. And again, the idea of ley lines, or fixing breaks in earth energy comes into that kind of ritual practice.
So is there an idea that these ley lines can be disrupted then by human construction or the M3,
yes.
for instance?
Yeah, there is, and there's also a connection with the traditional beliefs in the fairy. There's fairy paths, they're called, routes that connect different ring forts or fairy forts that I mentioned earlier on. So these are like the term ley line wouldn't have been used in the historical folklore collections, but the way that these routes that fairies are believed to take, the way that they're described is very similar to the idea of ley lines. And there's the belief that if you build on a fairy path, the people that live in the dwelling will become sick or die, and that if you build an outhouse or something on a fairy path, it will, the roof will come off of it or it will collapse. Mm-hmm. So there are similar ideas, and pagans connect with those traditions as well. So
okay. So last thing I wanted to ask you about, and I suspect we're largely in agreement about this. So I've mainly studied Buddhism, actually, but I do have an interest in paganism and magical beliefs and practices. And I've found that, every now and then, if I mention this to someone, I'll get the weird look about you're interested in what. And there are so many negative associations and misconceptions. I think that academic study of these practices is sometimes also seen as less than, seen as lesser, or even demonized. So first, I was going to say, do you think that's an accurate characterization? I think that from what I'm seeing, you do. But has that been your experience?
In how others categorize my research?
And how sometimes some people have these ideas about what the research is and associations with it.
Before I answer that, I should answer. You asked me another question that I don't think I answered even about the understanding of divinity or God within paganism. Just to mention that, or try to answer that. So again, there's many different understandings of divinity, and for want of a better word. So that most pagans that I've interviewed would believe there are many different gods and goddesses, and some would believe that these different gods and goddesses are emanations or different representations of the god force and the goddess force. So there's a gender binary there, and some believe that the deities are literally there, have always been there in the world, and that human beings can still communicate with those deities through ritual, and through other means, like maybe telepathy, or it doesn't always have to be an intentional ritual. So there are others who don't believe in deities as having an independent existence, but they believe that they're archetypes. So that's going more into Jungian, like the more psychological understandings of what the deities are. And so that, again, there's various understandings of God or the divine. And I should mention too that not all pagans believe in magic. Some pagans believe in, they believe in deities, but they don't believe in magic as a force. So again, like that diversity is quite hard to describe or to encapsulate very easily into an answer. But then to answer your other question, at the outset of my research, most people, when I said paganism, they thought that I was researching either Satanism or they thought I was doing something on atheism, because the Catholic Church, also the Protestant churches, but particularly Catholic clergy in Ireland, historically used the word pagan to mean someone who had no religion, or was somehow anti-religious or antagonistic toward Christianity. And they use the word heathen in a similar way. So for especially older generations in Ireland, the understanding of pagan has that association of somebody who's anti-Christian, or someone who has no religion at all. So explaining that it's a contemporary religion is something I've had to do quite a bit. But in terms of academia, it wasn't very widely known about. When I started my research, I was in the Department of Folklore and Ethnology in University College Cork. So there was no study of religions in Ireland at the time. The Study of Religions department has been there for 6 years. Almost 7 years now. So this is quite a new field, a new discipline for Ireland, because up until relatively recently there was only theology. So people's understanding of my research is influenced by that as well. Because when I say study of religions, people assume I'm studying Christianity or Judeo-Christian traditions. So in general, pagan studies is still on the fringe of academia. So it is a marginalized field in some senses. As you said, it's maybe not taken as seriously, or it's seen as, I'm paraphrasing now, but it's not really yet on a par with Judeo-Christian or Islam. So it's kind of, hopefully that will change. And to mention as well, like the module, the course that I'm teaching at the moment this semester on Western esotericism and new religious movements is the first time ever that such a course has been taught at an Irish academic institution. So these things are quite new for Ireland.
So it sounds like there's a lot of interesting work to be done going forward.
But there is quite a bit of interest from students and from graduate students as well. So hopefully this field will grow.
So that brings me to a kind of a broader point, I guess. What do you think the value is in studying this kind of thing, and studying religion in general, I suppose?
Well, I think it's extremely important to document and understand people's beliefs. So, I mean, what people believe influences everything they do, and everything that happens in the world. I mean, you could claim that. So, I think it's one of the most important areas of the humanities and social sciences. If we're to understand people, whether we're anthropologists or any scholar in the humanities, if we want to understand people, this is going to come into it somehow. Belief.
Like I said, I think we're largely in agreement on that. I don't think I think we see eye to eye on that one. I agree. I don't think there's any way you can get a complete picture of humanity without studying spiritual and religious belief, because it does form such a core part of many people's identities, and has influenced throughout history all kinds of politics and the reasons people take certain actions and that kind of thing.
I mean, religion and culture, because I'm coming from an ethnological background.
And can you just quickly define what ethnography means? I'm not sure we had done that.
Okay. Well, ethnology as a discipline includes like anthropology, folkloristics, and to a certain extent, certain aspects of sociology if they do qualitative or kind of smaller scale research or participant observation. And ethnography then is what ethnologists do. So that would include interviewing, so this in-depth conversational style of interviewing, and also participant observation, which I talked about earlier on. So the ethnography is the practice or the field work, and the ethnography can also refer to the text at the end. So I'm publishing an ethnography on Irish paganism, so it can also refer to like the monograph or the study itself. But the culture and religion, I mean, you can't separate those things easily, and the religion is always part of the culture. And I'll explain what I mean by that. In Ireland, people might self-identify as not having any religion, but culturally they're still Catholic because of how they've been raised. So when you have, the school system is predominantly Catholic. You know, historically in Ireland, the church ran the schools, and the teachers were clergy. So the ideas influencing people from when they're very young, that's going to influence people whether or not they believe in it. And it's quite complex. So culturally, it's a Roman Catholic context. So it's hard to do any analysis without of how people live their lives without addressing that.
Right. So because religion has played such a large part in society, even those people who are not religious are still influenced by it because they're growing up in that milieu.
Yeah, and it also influences like the social structure, the institutions, healthcare, beliefs about sexuality, marriage, and so on. So it can't really ever be a totally separate category of life. So I think
although there
it's
are people that would like it to be,
yeah.
or would like religion not to play any role in those things, and that's how that would play out. It's an open question, but well, thank you very much for coming on and talking. This has been a really interesting conversation, so thanks for coming.
Yeah, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you.
All right, Jenny Butler, thank you again, and maybe we'll talk again sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to.